This experience at Taylor was unforgettable, but I'm left with one question. How am I going to give 20-something students in my future classroom exactly what they need, my undivided attention at times, when it was more difficult than I imagined giving it to these 3 students? At the beginning of this experience, I was terrified. I did not know how to handle 3 students on my own. I did not know how to teach math in a way that the students would enjoy using it. I did not know how to keep my students engaged during the whole hour. I had very little knowledge of how to make sure my objective statement aligned with the standards I wanted to teach. Through time and learning more about my students, I learned how to make math meaningful to them. Every day in my relevant statement, I would use a real-life example of how I used addition. I showed them how important math is to know because it is something that I and they will use daily and use for the rest of our lives. Oftentimes I would tell them the story about how I went to the store and how I had to use math to figure out how much money I could spend. I kept my students engaged by drawing on their interest of animals, monsters, and using their names and problems. I also had individual whiteboards that allowed the students to work out each problem on the whiteboard and then transfer it into their journals. I learned to make sure that my objective lined up with my standard and to have a clear understanding of what I was teaching. If I was not exactly sure what I was going to do and I did not explain it well to my students, then they were confused from the beginning, which made the learning impossible. This growth will help me with the 20-something kids in my classroom by giving them what they need. If I know my students, then I will be able to help them more than if I do not truly know them. By taking the time to know my students and to work with their strengths while working on their weaknesses will help me become a better teacher for them and help them be able to be the best they can be. When I had a clear objective that my students understood, they were able to blow my mind. They were able to fly through the guided practice and into independent practice with little to no problems. My students went to a whole new level of thinking when I clearly stated what I expected of them in a concise manner. In the future, I have to have a clearly stated objective statement. If I don't, my students will be confused, and with 20-something of them, I cannot afford confusion. Having an objective statement that the students understand is the best way to help them get what they need. My students became more engaged and developed a love of math as time went on. The students understood what was expected of them, and allowing them some freedom when working through problems that we created together helped with the engagement. When we created a problem together, the students were more excited to solve the problem because it was their work. It was not something that I created, it was something that we created together. Towards the end of our time together, I had the students create their own word problems to help further their ownership of each problem. Most of my students wanted to do the problems in their heads and not show the work at the beginning. As time went on, I noticed my students loved to write on the whiteboards. The whiteboards became my ally in teaching math. I let the students write on my whiteboard during guided practice and then transfer the work into their own math journals. This allowed them to be visual learners. When I had my students use manipulatives, this allowed them to be kinesthetic learners to show off a little bit. The base 10 blocks were our favorites to use. Using multiple intelligences and creating a sense of ownership will help me give each and every student what he or she needs. It allows me to play to my students' strengths while making their weaknesses better. It will also allow me to help the students create a desire to learn and make the learning their own instead of making it a problem that I am forcing them to do. My assessment allowed me to see exactly how my students were doing. If the students were using the correct terms, taking the steps to solve multiplication problems, if they could solve a problem independently. My assessment allowed me to really understand what they were doing and if I needed to reteach a topic. This assessment showed me which students were struggling and how much time each student needed to complete a problem. Choosing what to assess was somewhat difficult because each of my students was at a different place in his learning. I kept track by marking tallies or by putting the students' initials in the part of the assessment that they had mastered. I will do this for each student in my future classroom. In the future, I want to be able to help each and every student with his or her independent needs. This was difficult to do at times, but by taking assessments and getting to know my students in the future, this will be possible.